everyone. My name's Helen Lovatt and I'm Professor of Classics at the University of Nottingham, and I have been spending a lot of time learning about the Argonauts. So this presentation will introduce you to the author Bernard Evslin and his Jason and the Argonauts. It's part of my work on my In Search of the Argonauts book, and in this talk I will tell you about a little bit about the clashing rocks in the Argonaut tradition, and then I will introduce you to Bernard Evslin and go through Evslin's own clashing rocks episode, and then I'll have a look at a few aspects of that episode and analyse them in relation to our mythical nature. I'll look at the idea of the anchor stone. I'll look at rationalising and mythologising interpretations of nature, and I'll look at how Evslin in particular plays around with audience expectations and make some suggestions about the implications of that for thinking about mythical nature. So I've just finished writing In Search of the Argonauts, and the book will be out on the 12th of August, which is really exciting. This is an opportunity to share some of that research. The project mainly focused on the interface between myth and reception, so looking at the ways that mythical traditions are receptions and the way that receptions of myth function. And I was trying to take a sort of broad overview of the entire Argonaut tradition from its beginnings right up to the present day, which was obviously a bit crazy. I focused in on various aspects, particularly interpretation of the figure of Jason, the relationship between the epic tradition and Argonauts, and I also looked at the importance of mythography and also of children's literature. As is perhaps unsurprising to people here, it was particularly rich and rewarding material. And I did this thematically. I looked at femininity and sexuality, masculinity and leadership, entertainment and the marvellous, ethnography and otherness, heroism and betrayal, and the sort of overall symbolism attributed to the quest or journey and also to the quest object or the fleece. And this aspect, the clashing rocks, was something that I dealt with under the idea of the marvellous, and in particular its associations with divine intervention. And today I want to explore a bit more its associations with the natural world and how that relates to traditions of interpreting myth. So the clashing rocks are a really important aspect of the Argonaut story. So it's the sort of number one iconic thing, quite often referred to on the cover image or the title of various versions. And the Argonauts pass through the clashing rocks, or the Symplegades, which are also known as the dark blue rocks. That's how Apollonius refers to them in the first few lines of his Argonautica, the Chianaean rocks, or sometimes the Synormades, the rocks that rush together. So that where they pass through from the Bosphorus to the Black Sea is a sort of threshold moment in the narrative of the Argonaut story, between the sort of known world of the Mediterranean Sea and the unknown world of the Black Sea, the friendly sea, which is really the hostile sea, but it's well known for its storms and its dangers. There are also various other sort of junctures of the Mediterranean world which are similar to the Symplegades, the wandering rocks, or the plancti, which are usually located in the Straits of Messina, and they're sometimes conflated too with Scylla and Charybdis. So the first mention of the Argo is in connection with the plancti, the wandering rocks, where Circe tells Odysseus what's going to happen, and she talks about the Argo as the first ship to successfully negotiate the plancti, and talks about the Argo as Passi Melusa, well known to all. So this idea of the Argo as a story that lurks behind the Odyssey is one of the oldest traditions of a journey in Greek mythology. It's quite important in the Argonaut tradition. So the Clashing Rocks is really at the centre of the Argonaut story. And I've given you here an image of the Argonauts' journey. They start in Iolkos, and then I've ringed the Symplegades here at the end of the Bosphorus, just near Istanbul, into the Black Sea, where they go all the way over to Colchis, to Aya, at the other end of the Black Sea in modern-day Georgia. And then there are lots of different return journeys. This is the one from Apollonius, an interpretation of it from Hunter's 2015 commentary on Book 4. And you can see here that the Plancti in this version are located in the Straits of Messina. There are lots of traditions of interpreting the Clashing Rocks in the Argonaut tradition. Different rationalising versions include the idea that they are driven together, clashed together by powerful winds, which occurs in the late antique Orphic Argonautica, probably from the 5th century. Then there's a sort of combination of winds and currents, and the dangerous currents of the Bosphorus, which is what Apollonius implies in his narrative of the episode. And that's very much sort of drawn on and developed in Tim Severin's really interesting archaeological reconstruction of the Argonaut voyage. Quite a few people think that the Clashing Rocks were icebergs that had travelled south for some reason. Kingsley is one of the first versions of this that I found, and it's taken up by important and influential later versions like Graves's Greek Myths, for instance, also Henry Treece's novelisation. And some people thought that perhaps the Clashing Rocks were an interpretation of a geological feature where you have rocks that are connected by a spur that is visible only at low tide, so that they seem to move in and out. So at low tide you could see them connected together, but at high tide you couldn't. It's possible they were bigger at the top than at the bottom, and it was possible to go through them at low tide but not at high tide, which would also give the impression of them moving closer together or coming apart. So there's a lot of rationalising interpretations of the Clashing Rocks, but an ongoing theme that sort of exists concurrently with the rationalising is the importance of the gods, either divine intervention or having the favour of the gods in order to pass through. And this is something that's also very much present in Apollonius. In the tradition, there tends to be either an emphasis on the favour of the gods or on human power and ingenuity. Usually there is a bird involved. So the Argonauts carry with them a bird who flies through the rocks first and causes them to clash together. And then because the Argonauts can see the timing of the dove going through, they can then use that as a way of timing their own passage and getting it right. So you've got either the omen, that if the dove goes through safely, that means the gods favour them and they will get through safely too, or you've got the timing device, which is very much associated with more modern versions with computer games, where quite often there are complex barriers to progress through a computer game that you can only get through by timing very accurately and effectively. And so you can see that becoming prevalent as the idea of as computer game sort of modes of engagement become more popular. It's also interesting to see how over time the Clashing Rocks become less a sort of natural rock formation, and often are represented more like city streets. So they are sort of tall, narrow, squared off, and they become sort of more technological and less natural as representations go on. And that comparison is already made in Treece's novel in the 1960s, but it becomes more obvious. And I've just got a few images from various different children's literature versions from recent years, and you can see how the influence goes backwards and forwards between children's literature and other visual media like film. So here's the very famous image from the 1963 Ray Harryhausen film Jason and the Argonauts, where the rocks are falling down on the Argonauts, but Triton holds them together. So it's a sort of rock fall that he prevents from destroying the ship as they go through under his arm. And you've got the lovely sort of splashing water and the miniature Argo going there through in that image. And then the 2000 TV movie, obviously the special effects have come on quite significantly by then. And what they have there are two, like, a long thin passage that gradually closes as the boat is going through, with the water becoming more and more churned up, and the Argo. This is a screenshot of the moment when the Argo just pops out, and they have survived that compression. And as you can see visually, it's very different. It's much more sort of technological and magical and less natural than in the 1963 film. Also published in 1963 was Ian Serolia's retelling the Clashing Rocks. So he uses the idea of the rocks as the title, although they're not on the cover. And another quite influential illustration is from the Usborne retelling by Felicity Brooks, which was illustrated by Graham Humphreys in 1997. This one's very widely available and I think had quite a significant impact, say, on the 2000 TV movie. And you can see here that it again has that sort of long, narrow, but there's a sort of mixture of the closing passageway and the rockfall in that version. Sofia Zarabuka gives a hint of the sort of darkness ahead as they go into the passage, while Claudia Zeff's version for much younger readers, also from Usborne, you can see the rocks moving like the keel of the ship. You've got the bird going through and being safe on the other side, the one white feather, and then you've got the timing version here. Start rowing, the wind was against them, the rocks began to close together, faster, faster. The goddess Athena saw the danger, sent a wave to help them. So you've got the idea of divine intervention, and the ship squeezed through just in time. That the timing version and the divine intervention combined in the version. There are quite a few more recent graphic novels, and you can see here the sort of looming rocks above, as well as the dove and the rockfall, combined with the sort of human effort of the rowers pushing through in this graphic novel by Yomtov and Sandoval, 2009. And another graphic novel from Whitehead and Banerjee, going for an even sort of longer, thinner, sort of gradual squeezing together with that sort of rumbling noise, and the bird just escaping as they go through, and a lot of emphasis on Jason's in leadership and determination as they push here. A sort of further perspective with, this is very much Harryhausen influence. You can see the rockfall and the rocks on the water, but also the rocks clashing together. So this 2015 version by Hoena had a much more of an interest in displaying its authenticity. So it has these fact panels and it had a consultant. So it's trying to sort of move back towards a more academic informed ancient version, but it's also very much influenced by the Harryhausen film. So what we're focusing on today, one particular idiosyncratic version of Jason and the Argonauts by the American author Bernard Evslin, who was alive from 1922 to 1993. He was born in New York, New Rochelle, and studied at Rutgers. And he already had a pedigree as a playwright, screenwriter, and documentary producer when he began writing in the 1960s. And he published over 70 books, including over 30 for young adult audiences. And his biggest selling book was Heroes, Gods and Monsters of the Greek Myths, which was translated into 10 languages and sold more than 1 million copies. And he's also award-winning. The 1986 book Hercules won the Washington Irving Children's Book Choice Award. And so this is from a similar period to his Jason and the Argonauts from 1986, illustrated by Bert Dodson. And we know a reasonable amount about his situation because he included a very helpful note from the author at pages 162 to 5. So I don't know how much classics he had in his education, whether he actually had a classics degree or had studied at school, but he represents himself as a classicist, having undergone the privileged ordeal of a classical education. I have been able to pick and choose amongst those bits and pieces and half-told tales. So he shows a very good awareness of the complexity of classical myth. And he lists in his author's note Pindar, Hesiod, Apollodorus, Apollonius, Homer, Herodotus, and Valerius Flaccus. And he shows a real awareness of the complexity of the tradition. There is no authorised text of any myth, and particularly none of this cycle. His voice feels to me Irish-American in the way that he phrases and uses metaphor and imagery. And possibly the name Bernard also suggests that to me. It's certainly one of the most creative and memorable versions that I've looked at. And it's quite interesting how he shapes the image of his writing in his author's note. He sees the Argo's voyage as a fundamentally meta-poetic image, a tale well told as a kind of argosy, launching you on uncharted seas, pleasures that are very strange but half familiar, as if fledged out of your own dreams. And it does feel to me like his writing has a dreamlike quality, and also uses motifs of dreams quite often. Among my happiest memories are those when I felt myself embarking on such a voyage of joyous piracy. So he sees the Argonauts as complex, disenfranchised, not, straightforward, and he himself feels that he is a sort of Argonaut. So in his particular version of Jason and the Argonauts, the focalising character is Echion, the son of Hermes, who is generally included in the voyage as a herald. And he alternates chapters between first-person narrative in the voice of Echion and third-person narrative looking at wider events. And his Jason is one of the most positive in the tradition. He is sort of young, he's basically quite nice, sort of benign, naive, trying his best, and Echion feels quite a lot of jealousy towards him because his father Hermes favours him more than he does his own son. And also the goddess Aphrodite in this version is in love with him, with Jason. So this Jason is a superb athlete, particularly a superb swimmer. The crew is relatively small. It includes two of Echion's brothers, Daphnis and Autolycus, plus also Castor and Pollux, the canonical Argonauts, along with an aggressive Idas, who in this version has bronze jaws, thinking of Bond movies, and then there's the shipbuilder Argos and Echion's best friend Rufus the blacksmith, and most versions seem to have their one idiosyncratic made-up character, and in this case it's Rufus. In this version, Medea and Jason is not the main love story. The main love story is between the nymph Lethe, who is a sort of Dory character, that she's continually forgetting everything. she seduces Jason and takes, the real relationship is between them, and Medea takes revenge for that relationship by killing their child and leaving Jason alive. So Medea here is very much the villain. And this version, Jason does manage to bring the fleece back to Iolcus. And the fleece here is a sort of form of weather magic, which is used to put an end to a drought amongst his people. And when he comes back to Iolcus with the fleece, Pelias literally explodes. So Jason is actually able to become king. And he's scraping gobs of king off the walls. So Evan's Clashing Rocks episode is foreshadowed in an earlier chapter where Echion he's preparing a dream potion to make Jason do what Hermes has planned, and he accidentally gives himself a vision of all sorts of things, and the main part of his vision is the clashing rocks. And in this vision, the rocks hurtle together and crush the ship. With an odd, rushing, gurgling sound, the boulders began to hurtle through the water towards each other. They sluiced through the water and came together, crushing the tiny ship to splinters. The rocks sank, sucking the wreckage under. And this is obviously what happens in both of the films, where the first ship they see sinks and is destroyed. So in the 1963 one, it's Medea's ship, and they then rescue her, and in the 2001 it is the ship of her brother Absyrtus. So in this bit of the dream, the rocks sound like they have intentionality, but we don't know for sure that they do. And then when the actual Clashing Rocks episode occurs, it's the first episode out of port, so he sort of squishes all the narrative up together, and putting this first avoids the Lemnian women and Phineas, and also doesn't have any sort of Hercules either. And as they're arriving, Echion goes into a sort of trance, re-experiencing his dream, and then he tries to warn them, but the wind blows away his words. So you've got this idea of the failing prophet, the Cassandra figure. If my dream had been truly prophetic, then the rocks were driven by an evil intelligence and were intending to catch us between them. So this idea of them as agents, as actually intelligent creatures. So there's no idea of a bird, there's no omen, there's no prophecy from Phineas, there's no sense of the favour of the gods here. We've just got a straight battle of intelligence between Echion and Jason and the rocks. So it plays around with audience expectations in quite explicit ways. So, for instance, so I saw that we were going fast enough to pass between the rocks, but even as I thought this, the rocks picked up speed. So they keep responding and changing the narrative. They were huge, towering high above the mast. They were massive chunks of mountain risen from the bottom of the sea to destroy us. They were close now. I could see the mosses that grew upon them, purple and green, and their crust of barnacles, and that very much recalls what happens in Treece, where you also can see stuff on the rocks as they go through them and sort of scrape through. In this case, Argos manages to turn the boat. There's a lot of emphasis on its technological sophistication. And Argos and Echion hoped that they would collide, but then, sickening sight, they swerved simultaneously and began to pursue us, ploughing through the water side by side. So that's sort of like two boats or predators. And Echion at this point prays for wind to make the Argo go faster, and it does come. But as soon as he realises his prayer has been successful, he thanks the gods, and it immediately stops, at which point the rocks are going to catch them. So again, there's this sort of capriciousness of the gods and of the narrative. Jason all along so far has been attached to the top of the mast, a bit like Acastus in the 1963 film. He's been watching from there. And it's at this moment that he dives into the sea, and there's this beautiful description of him diving. Whiteness fell from the sky like a swan plunging. But why? He would affect them no more than a bird sharpening its beak. So Echion is looking at him, sort of amazed by his beauty, but also thinking of him as a bird. And then Jason swims towards the rocks, who at that point seem confused. They stop, they draw apart, and Echion thinks that maybe they've escaped, but then the rocks rush together. I saw why the rocks drifted apart, realised they were indeed directed by a living intelligence. They were closing like giant jaws. They wouldn't even leave a corpse if they met upon him. He would be a pinkish spot spreading on the waters. And there's a sort of paradoxical, cartoon-like violence that is also quite surprisingly fleshy in Evslin. It comes back in other episodes as well. The gulls seemed to know they were being offered a meal. They dived screaming, plunging so close they risked being caught between the rocks. So you've got the actual birds there, as well as a sort of metaphorical bird in the shape of Jason. Suddenly the gulls vanished. More slowly, the dust cleared. The boulders had disappeared. Fragments of rock littered the water. And you've got that's very much like the 1963 film. Echion doesn't know whether or not to want Jason dead. What was I hoping? Did I want to see the black head breaking water beyond the litter? Or did I want to detect blood on the water? I seemed to feel my eyes burn, hungry as a gull's for a glimpse of redness among the rock litter, or a bone or a gobbet flesh. So Echion himself also is like a gull. So we've got the imagery moving backwards and forwards between different characters. Whatever I hoped, I saw him surface, broaching like a porpoise. And so Jason here has taken on a sort of role as a sea animal, shedding diamonds of water drops. His voice bowled across the still air like thunder. And so Jason takes on something sort of semi-divine in his success of making the rocks crash into each other and destroy themselves. One stone about the size of a fist followed him as he swam, so they retain this sort of uncanny agency and intelligence. And when he reached the stern, that white stone leaped out of the sea and landed on the deck. It rolled to his feet. It was as if this single stone were the survivor of those boulders that had dashed themselves to death upon each other, as if it had inherited their weird energy and menacing intelligence and now offered itself to the victor. So he has this sort of follower that is also a rock, and that continues the weirdness on the uncanny nature of Evslin's rock. And the rock goes on then to act as an anchor stone when they reach Bibrikos for the boxing match with Amicus, which is the one major episode he keeps from the journey out. By this time, Jason's rock had grown to boulder size and rolled behind him wherever he went, sliding off the deck and surging after him when he swam. Jason spoke to the rock. It rolled into its harness, slid to the edge of the deck, went overboard and sank. The cable stretched taut and the Argo swung at a bow mooring where there was no bottom. So the idea of anchors is quite important in the Argonaut tradition, and sort of this, he's squishing together different aspects in the image of the clashing rocks, and also thinking about the idea of anchor stones as well. So Apollonius, for instance, mentioned that the Argonauts replace a light with a heavy anchor stone at the island of Cyzicus, where they dedicate the abandoned stone, and then the one they leave behind, so this sort of represents an increasingly epic element in the second part of the voyage, or the more dangerous Black Sea. The one they leave behind then becomes a sort of sacred marker in the landscape in the temple of Jasonian Athena. And there's evidence elsewhere of actual veneration of supposed anchor stones, for instance in Arrian's Periplus of the Black Sea, sailing around the Black Sea, where the anchor of Argo is shown in Aya. Ancient fragments of a stone anchor were also shown, so that one might reckon that these are more likely to be the remains of the anchor of the Argo. So that idea of stones and anchors and remains in the landscape of the journey. It's quite resonant. It suggests the way that storytelling is made concrete in specific features. The idea of the clashing rocks as living is not completely made up either. It's there in Pindar, and Pindar Pythian 4 has a very important effect on later literary versions. In his description of the clashing rocks, he described them as zoai, Didumaigar Esan zoai, and in Nisetich translation, two of them rocks instinct with life. And this idea of the sort of rumbling noise that they make, and the fact that they stopped afterwards, are there also, of course, evoking what happened with the Phaeacian ship in the Odyssey. So Evan is very interested in the sort of relationship between nature and technology, and he talks about the Argo as a sort of development in technology. Argos adds a pivoted rudder board and a mast that tilted the sail, and also claims he learnt the design when he voyaged to the land beyond the dawn, where dwell little men with tilted eyes and parasols growing out of their heads. So he's playing around with the sort of Herodotean ethnography. And then we've got, I mentioned already, the prosthetic jaw that Idas has. And in this version, Pollux' hands are sliced off in a discus accident. It's pretty gruesome. At which point, the blacksmith Rufus makes him prosthetic metal hands. And this sort of idea of the post-human and the cyborg is obviously already present in the Argonaut tradition, in the bulls, the bronze bulls or the bronze-hoofed bulls, and in Talos as the last bronze man, which of course is very important in the 1963 film. Evslin was also extremely rich in imagery, and he's clearly playing around with the clashing rocks as a metaphor in a lot of different ways. So to start with, the rocks are sort of representative of the active malevolence of the natural world towards men. And Jason then conquers them so that they sort of transfer their fealty to him. And he uses his sort of cunning and daring as a sort of sacrificial offering by sort of going on his own one for the whole. And on the one hand, the rocks show the agency of the natural world, in that they have their sort of intelligence and they shape the way that Jason behaves. But they also show how this agency is reciprocal. So what Jason does then changes how they are and controls them. And you've got a lot of this going on elsewhere in the narrative, for instance, in Lethe as the sort of embodiment of forgetfulness, in the Northwind Boreas, who is another sort of villain figure, but also incorporates the idea of storm, and then Medea, who's often described in terms evoking birds. And all of these people are attempting to control Jason. And then the fleece is important because that allows Jason to create rain and save his people and sustain his kingdom's agriculture. So you've got this whole idea of a sort of tussle between humanity and the natural world over control. And Evslin is clearly playing around with traditions of interpreting the natural world through and alongside mythology. So he clearly is interested, from his author's note, in the historical background of possible Argonaut expeditions, and he imagines that there were at least 7 voyages. I like the continual use of the number 7, which is obviously very important in folk tales. And he takes the ancient idea of gods or nymphs as aspects of nature or human behaviour, and then extends that to the clashing rocks, where it isn't generally applied, although it's a sort of obvious continuation or extension of the way that Scylla and Charybdis work elsewhere. And it's quite interesting to see in another recent version by Kevin Knoiper, the clashing rocks become a sort of technological device where they're a passage through the walls which gradually which responds self-closing to unauthorized access. So again, that sort of agency of the inanimate through technology. We can also see the way that Evslin is constantly playing with previous versions and audience expectations. So the double nature of children's literature. So it works for people who know and people who don't know. So this idea of where the gods are called upon but then don't seem to help but then actually don't. So will there or won't there be divine intervention? You've got two traditions, one where there is and one where there isn't. We've got the sort of continual evocation of the role of the bird, which actually is not in this particular version, but first Jason takes that on, then Echion. And then you've got the sort of omen version with the prophecy, and in this case Echion's dream. And then you've got the timing version where they're going to sort of go super fast and get through by going at exactly the right moment. But neither of those actually turn out to be effective here, and instead Jason has to offer himself as a sort of potential sacrificial victim, a little bit like Palinurus in the Aeneid, the one. But in the end, he is not sacrificed, as you might have expected him to be, but survives, and it's the rocks that instead destroy themselves. And at the moment, when they start pursuing the Argonauts, that transforms them from the sort of malevolent natural landscape that can be rationalised into a sort of monstrous other, like a sea monster, or particularly, I think, with the mention of them as Jaws, shark imagery, as does, I think, that image of Jason as a sort of red smear on the sea surface. And you can also see the idea of massively accelerated processes of erosion and instability in the coastal landscape. So the fact that at any point rock stacks, arches can collapse or crash down on you, and that fragmentation of the rocks, with the rocks all over the surface of the sea. So Argonauts are quite useful for thinking about our mythical nature, and Evslin is a particularly interesting example, although not particularly influential on later versions, sadly. I think he's a much underestimated author of ancient myth, reteller of ancient myth. The Argonauts interact with nature in a lot of ways. This idea of the Argo as the first ship, which is so important in Roman literature, and the sort of idea of creating wider journeying, joining together different societies, enabling travel, commerce and war, is quite important in the Argonaut myth. And also the way that they leave natural signs and unnatural signs of the voyage everywhere that they go. So, for instance, there are springs named after the Argonauts, there's the anchor stone, there are petrified rocks, there's the names of paths, there are hills, there are temples. So there's all these sort of Argonauts in the landscape everywhere that you go around the Mediterranean and Eastern Europe. And it's really interesting to see Evslin re-mythologizing where novel traditions, including young adults such as Ken Catran, tend to rationalize. So he's taken where previous traditions have come up with rationalizations like Kingsley's icebergs, he's used a deep understanding of the workings of myth in a variety of different cultures and traditions, and then he's put that together with the license he feels in writing for a child or young adult audience to be playful and to do complex, unexpected things, and gestures towards a wide variety of existing interpretations, particularly those that are current in Robert Graves, like the mother goddess worship, the idea of human sacrifice, weather gods, and a lot of complex erotic play going on there, including Echion's sort of desiring gaze at Jason as swimmer. So he uses all these things very effectively to create a highly original and fascinating version of the Argonautica, and I shall stop there. Thank you very much.